Hello, everyone. This is Ann Reynolds. I'm with the Alliance for Clean Energy. Welcome to this Clean Energy Seminar, part of ACE New York's seminar series. It's actually the first one that we're doing in 2021. We started this in 2020 in the world of COVID and actually found that we got really great participation from the public, and it was a new way to reach out to people and talk about the issues that we're working on. So thank you so much for joining. We have a great program for you today about policies we need for transportation electrification. So the Alliance for Clean Energy New York has members that are active in the clean energy industry, including offshore wind, solar, batteries, transmission, electric vehicles, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and energy efficiency, as well as hydroelectric. I've probably missed some, but that's the flavor of who we are. But we're here today to talk about transportation electrification. We have some great speakers. And before I announce the first, I will say that today's event is co-hosted with New Yorkers for Clean Power. And we really thank them for doing that. And Michaela, I think, is just going to say hello.
Hey everyone, I'm Michaela Shravaco with New Yorkers for Clean Power. We are a statewide campaign promoting renewable energy, energy efficiency, and clean transportation, and so happy to co-host today and see everyone.
Thanks so much, Mick. Appreciate it. As you all know, if you want to get anything done, here in New York State, you often have to direct your attention to the New York State Legislature, which is one of the reasons that we're so glad to have Assemblyman Bill Magnarelli with us today. He represents the 129th Assembly District, which includes a batch of neighborhoods in Syracuse, New York, as well as some surrounding communities around Syracuse. He first won election in 1998, and during his terms in office, Assemblyman Magnarelli has focused his efforts on bringing more jobs to Central New York, lowering taxes, providing students a better education, improving access to healthcare, and supporting veterans. But he also serves as the chairman of the New York State's Assembly Transportation Committee, which is why we're so glad to have him with us here today. Thank you for joining us, Assemblyman.
Well, you're welcome, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. So I'm just going to ask a couple questions and then give you the floor. Here at ACE New York, we're very interested in transportation electrification, but we know that the state of New York is facing all sorts of transportation issues at the same time, and it's important for us to know that context in which we're advocating. So I wanted to invite you to weigh in on what you think are the big issues facing transportation in New York this year and next year. And then the second question is, given that context, what do you think might be ripe for action in terms of cleaning up transportation or reducing emissions from the transportation sector? So I will turn it over to you.
Well, first of all, let me say I'm missing a little bit of my session right now, so I have to get back. So I apologize for that. But on the other hand, that question is so broad. I mean, really, as far as transportation is concerned, the focus needs to be on infrastructure, okay, more than anything that I see at this point in time. But infrastructure includes a lot of things, okay? It's not only roads and bridges we also hear about sewers and water and things like that. It also is the infrastructure we're going to need to fuel our cars in the future, or to fuel transportation in the future. And we see that as being electricity, okay? So as part of this infrastructure that needs to be attended to is also the idea that we have to have charging infrastructure for the new vehicles that are being brought to market now. So that's one of the basic things. The other thing is, to me, and in transportation, is mass transportation. There's no need for each one of us to be driving a vehicle. Okay. So whether it be short distances where we can use bikes and other types of transportation, walk, which I do a lot of, by the way. We also have to think of mass transportation within our urban areas and our rural areas where there are basically transit deserts, where people can't get around anymore, where because of the ways we fund things, the unintended consequences are that people are literally stranded in their homes, especially if they're disabled or as they grow older. So these are things that have to be adjusted. And when we talk about mass transportation, a lot of us think of the MTA and the subways down in New York City. I also think of the bus transportation up here in central New York and upstate New York. And these too have to be converted from fossil fuels into electric type of vehicles to transport our people. And also, as far as not only people, but commodities, freight, okay? These too we have to change. We've got right now trucks that are delivering goods all over the place. These have to be changed they have to be electrified. As I think we have to do a better job with our railroads and trains. Things are happening now that are allowing for us to get many, many trucks off the road, cars off the road, by using things like the train. So all of these things come around to what I started out with, and that is infrastructure. And we need to build out these various infrastructures to allow for these changes that are going to be coming. There's no question about it. They're coming. And we have to do that as quickly as possible. Those are my answers to your questions, basically. I hope I did it.
You did. Thank you. No, that was helpful. A follow-up question, since you have the infrastructure theme, we're all hoping for great things from the federal government in the next coming years, or next year, or whenever they vote on infrastructure. What would you put on the list of your hopes for that federal infrastructure legislation?
Well, for me, it's roads, bridges, and rail. Without a doubt. But again, as chair of the Transportation Committee, that's my focus. I'm sure there's other things that need infrastructure monies as well, but we need to maintain our roads, maintain our bridges, and basically enhance our rail transportation in New York State. I keep feeling, as far as I'm concerned, we're in the early 1900s as far as railroads are concerned in New York. I just give you an example or an aside. If I could get back and forth to Albany from Syracuse in 2.5 hours on a train all the time, knowing that it's going to be on time, knowing that it's going to get there on time, I would take the train. And that would be going at 60, 65 miles an hour. That's it. It can't do that because of delays that occur because of our infrastructure. And these are the things that we have to change. If somebody could go from Syracuse to New York City in 4.5, 5 hours at 60 miles an hour, they wouldn't take a car. They would not. They'd be in the middle of Manhattan, in 4.5 hours, get off a train and be there. They wouldn't be taking planes, because it doesn't make any sense to wait hours in airports and go through all of the commotion, where you can get on a train and just be there in 4.5 hours. So I think that, that's where we have to look. It really is an infrastructure problem. I am hoping that the federal government passes a few $1 trillion worth of infrastructure money that will allow us to do things like that, as well as build out the electric infrastructure that we need for vehicles going forward as well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate those remarks. I agree with you on the trains, by the way. I take the train from New York all the time from Albany, but try to go from Albany to Buffalo on the train, and
It's a real risky business in terms of being there on time.
It
Right.
sure is. It sure is. Well, I do know that you have to get back to session, so I didn't want to keep you too much longer, but I will say thank you. First, thank you for joining us and the 66 people that we have watching. Also, you know, Alliance for Clean Energy New York has been around for a long time focusing on renewables. Our transportation program is newer, so I'm going to apologize in advance that I'm going to be bothering you a lot from now on.
That's fine. We look forward to it. This is high on the agenda and things that we have to do going forward. So I look forward to talking to you.
Great.
All of you, by the way. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so before we go on to our speakers, I wanted to mention one thing is that just yesterday, ACE New York released an issue brief on clean transportation. And we do a series called Clean Energy, Building Clean Energy in New York. This is the third in that series. Our goal with this white paper was to serve as a resource for ourselves and for all of you who are interested in the transition to a clean transportation system by putting in one place some basics about transportation electrification, about the barriers to transportation electrification, the market drivers, so the good news and the bad news, and then also some specific strategies that we think New York should adopt in order to kickstart transportation electrification. And as you heard from the Assemblyman, an absolutely equal part of this puzzle is increasing mobility and accessibility and improving public transit. So we're getting people out of their cars and into subways, buses, and trains. That is not the subject of this issue brief, but we do acknowledge that it's an equally important topic. So it is available on our website. We urge you to take a look. It has a lot of background information about how New York is doing now, how we're doing compared to other states who might be ahead of us, and what we need to do to catch up. And I also can see that if you go to the chat right now, there's a link to that new issue brief, which was written by Anastasia Gordon, also the organizer of this seminar. So we appreciate her work, and we hope that for those of you in the legislature or the public, that the issue brief is a good resource for you. It's basically our policy agenda for the next few years. So if you want to know what ACE is going to be working on for transportation, that's a good place to check. So a little bit more on legislation, but I'm not going to cover this myself. I'm going to introduce my colleague, Deb. Deb is on the ACE team after 20 years with the New York State Legislature. 10 of those years were the committee director for the Senate Environmental Conservation Committee. And so she has broad knowledge of energy and environmental policy in New York. She worked on the net metering law, the electric vehicles tax credit, a reorganization of LIPA, a lot of thorny issues there, Deb, that you had to work on. But now she leads ACE's energy efficiency, transportation, electrification work, as well as our legislative work in general. She holds a master's degree in environmental policy from the University of Wisconsin. And I'm going to turn it over to Deb to talk about some specifics about legislation.
Thank you, Anne. I am just going to bring up one slide here that will list all of our bills. There we go. Thank you. Knowing that the transportation sector is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in New York State, and it's a significant health threat from particulate emissions and smog emissions, ACE New York had worked with our members and partners to strategically select this listing of bills to reduce barriers to electric vehicle adoption in our state. There are numerous EV bills that are before the legislature, and ACE New York supports several of them, but these are our priority bills. And two of them have already passed both houses. Senator Harkin's bill, Senate Bill 2758, and Assemblyman Englebright's Bill 4302 would enact California's requirements for zero-emission vehicles. This bill would require the state to develop regulations and market development strategies for all in-state sales of new passenger cars and trucks to be zero emission by 2035, for 100% of medium and heavy-duty vehicles to be zero emissions by 2045, and also by 2035, a transition all off-road vehicles to be emission-free. This bill has passed both the Senate and the Assembly and is awaiting being sent to the governor. Senator Kennedy's bill, Senate Bill 3929, and Assemblyman Kuzik's bill, Assembly 3876, would require utilities to establish a new electric vehicle charging rate as an alternative to traditional demand-based rates to facilitate fast charging. This bill has passed both the Senate and the Assembly and is awaiting being sent to the governor. Senator Kaminsky's bill, Senate Bill 1763, and Assemblywoman Fahey's bill, Assembly Bill 4614, would remove the current cap of 5 on the number of sellers of new zero-emission vehicles beyond the traditional franchise auto dealers. These new sales locations would be available to those that only manufacture ZEVs, and they would have the same consumer protections as auto dealerships. This bill is in the transportation committees in both the Senate and the Assembly. Senator Parker's bill, Senate Bill 2962A, and Assemblywoman Warner's bill, Assembly 862A, would establish a carbon intensity standard for all transportation fuels and create a private trading system where fuels cleaner than the standard would generate credits purchased by those more polluting than the standard, with the carbon intensity standard decreasing annually, thereby encouraging the gradual switch away from gasoline to alternatives like electricity. This bill is in the Environmental Conservation Committees in both the Senate and the Assembly. And our last bill, Senator Kennedy's bill, 5268, and Assemblywoman Fahey's bill, Assembly Bill 6754, would provide financial incentives to schools for the purchase or lease of electric school buses with greater funds available to higher need districts. This exempts electric school buses from state sales tax and allows schools to be reimbursed for their portion of electricity and charging infrastructure costs. It extends a bus lease period also from 5 to 10 years to encourage the leasing of electric buses. Thank you, Ann.
Thanks, Deb, for running through those with us. As Deb mentioned, it's not that these are the only electric vehicle policies under consideration in the legislature, but they are the ones we picked as priorities for a variety of reasons, which, by the way, if you read our issue brief, you will know. But now we're going to explore a little bit more about the 3 bills that have not passed both houses yet. So Deb ran through that 2 of them have, which is great news, but 3 of them have not. And so we're going to learn more about those measures. And our first speaker on those bills is Caitlin. Caitlin Monahan is the Manager of Public Policy and Senior Counsel at Rivian. She has a Bachelor's of Science degree in Environmental Science from the University of Florida, and also a Doctor of Law degree from Florida State University. Prior to being at Rivian, she was at the American Wind Energy Association, and it was fun to work with her there. But it's fun to work with her now when she's at Rivian. So we're really happy that she's going to talk to us a little bit more about that direct sales bill and what the implications for that would be in the real world. Hey, Caitlin, you're on mute. We cannot hear you. Oh. Still cannot hear you. I can see your mouth moving.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Thank you, Ann. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. As Ann mentioned, my name is Caitlin Monahan. I'm Manager of Public Policy and Senior Counsel for Rivian. And I'm here today to share our support and talk a little bit about the bill that Deb and Ann mentioned, Senator Kaminsky, Assemblymember Fahey's direct sales of electric vehicle bill. This is a really important bill that would allow for direct sales of electric vehicles in New York. If you haven't heard of Rivian, we were founded in 2009. We're an independent U.S. manufacturer of electric vehicles. We're backed by strong investors, and we have over 5,000 employees across the United States and several states that focus on the design, the development, the manufacture, and distribution of electric vehicles. Specifically, we make pickups and SUVs. And in addition to those consumer electric vehicle products, we also partnered with Amazon to create a last mile delivery vehicle for Amazon. They've ordered 100,000 of these electric delivery vehicles from us as part of their climate pledge. I don't hear the clicking noise myself, so I'm not sure if I can do anything about it, Anne. I'm sorry. Am I coming through okay, though?
We can hear what you're saying, but the clicking is also very loud. I'm not sure what causes that.
Oh, no.
Oh, well, that's better because there's no clicking, but now we can't hear you. Try again?
Okay, what about now?
Yeah, still clicking. Why don't you continue, and we'll do a little brainstorming on this end.
Okay, sorry about that. The fun of a Zoom panel is you just never know what you're gonna get dealt by the computer on any given day.
So true.
But Rivian is really thrilled to offer new and compelling EVs to New Yorkers to advance our mission to improve air quality and decarbonize the transportation sector. So I'm thankful to have the opportunity to discuss our direct-to-consumer business model. Rivian will sell and service our vehicles directly to consumers. That is an absolutely critical business model to allow us to break into the market. There's a huge barrier to entry for new companies. It's very difficult to be cost competitive, but this is one way we can bring these products to market. So this legislation is absolutely critical for us. We do not have any franchise agreements, third-party deals anywhere in the U.S. or the rest of the world. And right now in New York, you could buy a Rivian online because it's closed to our business model, and car buyers have to navigate considerable logistical and bureaucratic hurdles to purchase an electric vehicle, and that's because we're not able to invest there in the state in brick and mortar and have stores in the state. So it just creates another reason why someone wouldn't make the switch. And these hurdles can really discourage consumers from, is this better? I'm moving my phone away. Okay, great. So it can discourage them from making this switch. And for that reason, if New York isn't able to pass this legislation, the state could lose out on these clean alternatives, which will displace some of the heaviest polluters on the road, that large SUV and the truck. Currently, under New York law, it only allows one manufacturer of zero emission vehicles to sell out of 5 stores. So this bill would remove that cap, would allow that manufacturer to have more stores selling more EVs, and also it would allow new companies like Rivian, Lucid, Lordstown, All-American manufacturers to also invest in the state and make these products available. So for that reason, we think it's really critical piece of implementation for New York to meet its climate goals under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the CLCPA. It has really strong ZEV goals, climate changing emissions reduction goals, also as part of the ZEV MOU. There's a goal to have 850,000 ZEVs on the road by 2025. We're not even close to meeting that goal in New York, so removing these barriers to entry will only help New York meet those goals. So thanks for letting me talk about it. Sorry for the clicking noise that I don't hear. I hope it's not too bad. But happy to take any questions, and back to you, Anne.
Thank you so much. Can you mute yourself though? There we go. Thank you, Caitlin. Really appreciate that. And for those of you at home, she's very poised because I was haranguing her with texts during that presentation because of the clicking noise that she can't hear. So, and some of the comments in Q&A were about that. So apologies for that. But thank you so much, Caitlin, for that information about Rivian's business model and how it's not going to work in New York unless that direct sales of electric vehicles is allowed. Now, I'm back. Hi, folks. So a couple things that I forgot to mention is that we will be taking questions at the end of the three speakers, but you should type them right in the Q&A. We will get to them. So we have a few of those in there already. Thank you for those. And please feel free to add more, all of you, to the Q&A function. Our next speaker is Eileen Wenger Tut. She is the director of the California Electric Transportation Coalition, Cal-ETC, and has been for over 10 years. She was recently selected. What did I just say? let me just add that she worked in California state government for over 15 years. So she has experience both inside government and outside government. She was the deputy secretary for the California EPA and in various positions at CARB as well. So she's really dedicated her entire career towards clean transportation and clean fuels. And we're so happy to have her here to talk to us about California's experience with the low carbon fuel standard. This is another one of the legislative initiatives that ACE is supporting here in New York, but California has actually had this policy for quite some time, so it seemed like a good idea to learn from their experience. So Eileen, I will turn it over to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me here today, Caitlin and the group. So I want to start out by saying a little bit. My name is Eileen Tut, as Caitlin and Ann mentioned. But I just want to say that the California Electric Transportation Coalition has been around a lot longer than I've been the director there. It's existed for almost 30 years now through 2 generations of light-duty vehicles, and the organization exists to promote and commit to shifting away from carbon-based fuels, predominantly oil, to electricity fuel. And and our members, our board, it consists of primarily utilities. We are a nonprofit organization, but all of our members are industry members. So we're a trade association representing multiple industry members, including all of the utilities, the local utilities, the municipal utilities, the investor-owned utilities, as well as many automakers. Maybe Rivian will join, but certainly many automakers and many automakers that make zero-emission vehicles as well as zero-emission trucks and buses. We also have some charging infrastructure providers and some of the co-ops or community choice aggregators that support the utility industry in getting clean electricity to vehicles and to anybody who uses electricity. So to talk a little bit about our low carbon fuel standard, which I will say New York and many others who have adopted similar kinds of programs have rightfully renamed it the Clean Fuel Standard or the Clean Transportation Standard, which is a way better name than the low carbon fuel standard. So kudos, and there's been many other improvements by other states as you've moved forward, and we've been working with New York on their clean fuel standard. And it is, every time another state, or we look at it nationally, adopts it, I believe it actually becomes better, not only in California, but the other states have done an excellent job of improving and learning from some of our mistakes, hopefully with our input and admitting that we didn't get it totally perfect. I will say kind of the interesting thing about the low carbon fuel standard in California is that there's never been any legislation authorizing specifically the low carbon fuel standard. The legislature has long supported it, but it was initiated by then Governor Schwarzenegger, a Republican, in 2007 by an executive order. So it was administratively directed, and the governor directed the Air Resources Board, our California Air Resources Board, to adopt a low carbon fuel standard, which was the first of its kind in the nation, and really working hard with academia. So we brought in our university systems to help us design, and I was actually at the Air Resources Board and then at the California Environmental Protection Agency at the time as a Schwarzenegger appointee. So I have a long history with the low carbon fuel standard and supporting it. When it was adopted, it required a 10% reduction in carbon content of fuels. Predominantly, it was focused on the oil industry. And when it was adopted, there was an assumption, and I remember working very closely with many of the NGOs, especially the Natural Resources Defense Council, but the assumption was that it was going to be a liquid fuels mandate, and that it was intended to predominantly support the acceleration of the market for biofuels, and particularly cellulosic ethanol, so renewable kinds of biofuels. I think it is a tremendous testament to the strength of the low carbon fuel standard and the clean fuels programs that are being adopted across the country, that it has morphed over the years to be really fuel neutral. And what's risen to the top of the sort of credit generation with it is, if you will, is the focus on zero emission transportation fuels, particularly electricity and hydrogen. And to the degree there have been biofuels proliferation, which there have been, certainly more than that has been, they have dominated the credit generation, particularly in the early years, that's changing. And it is largely renewable diesel and electricity are really generating a lot of credits. So I think there is something to be said for policy that doesn't mandate a particular fuel type, but rather an outcome where we all want to go to really zero carbon or decarbonize our transportation fuel standard or our transportation fuel sector, which is incredibly difficult to do. I mean, I will say for my entire 30-year career, I worked on decarbonization of the transportation fuel sector in one capacity or another. And the low carbon fuel standard was the first policy that actually successfully accomplished that goal. And now we have our zero emission vehicle regulation and other regulations that are also very important. But one of the most controversial aspects at the time it was adopted and continues to be today was this idea of indirect land use calculations. So if you derive your fuel from something like palm oil that destroys the planet in other ways, it does not generate credits. It may, in fact, in some cases, even the ethanol industry, the carbon intensity, depending on how that ethanol is produced, can be higher than oil. So we don't get, it generates no credits. And I think that has been controversial through every single governor. It has caused the oil industry to really wage war against the low carbon fuel standard in California, but also in other states. because it does not, it recognizes that you can't just shift to another carbon-based fuel manufactured outside of the country or even import oil. You do have to look at what are the upstream emissions associated with whatever alternative fuel is trying to generate credits as an alternative to oil. The low carbon fuel standard was codified, I want to say, by the legislature through our climate change policy called AB 32 or SB 32, which was legislation that set climate change targets and referenced the low carbon fuel standard as one mechanism for getting there. So I think that's what's so interesting, and I'm just making sure I don't have any glitches or anything good I'm seeing in my chat box. But it referenced the other fuels. But anyway, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a minute. But I'm not as cool as our my Rivian counterpart. But anyway, it was challenged over and over again by the oil industry, and I want to take credit as CALI-TC, the California Electric Transportation Coalition, even before I came, but particularly after I came. The utility industry and the renewable utility electricity industry stepped up and filed amicus briefs, joined the litigation in defense of the low carbon fuel standard. So the electricity industry has been key to defending against those that have tried to basically kill the low carbon fuel standard in California and have actually succeeded in slowing it down. It was readopted in 2015. And then in 2018, despite extensive legal fights and winning almost every single one of the fights, if not every single one, which with our California Air Resources Board, it was increased to 20% carbon reduction by 2030. So, and not only that, it shifted to kind of recognize that electricity fuel was a viable credit generator. So like electricity fuel, there was no way to generate excess credits, unlike every single other fuel, if you were predominantly or entirely zero emission or renewable fuels. So all electricity sold to transportation got the same carbon intensity, no matter whether it was 100% renewable or not, unlike every single other fuel. And the Air Resources Board recognized that that needed to be changed. And so they modified the regulation to recognize that electricity can be renewable or not renewable, as our ACE friends know, and that it should generate more credit if it's cleaner. It also updated the carbon intensity to reflect the fact that the grid is getting cleaner and cleaner. So every year it was updated, much like every single other fuel. So even though there was tremendous opposition to these changes, the bottom line is the modifications were made because the regulation was written as a biofuels and a cellulosic ethanol liquid fuel regulation, and it became clear that it's actually a clean fuel regulation, not a specific liquid fuel regulation. So we also adopted, or the Air Resources Board adopted this thing called capacity credit. And the assembly member earlier brought up the idea of infrastructure, and I know he was talking about roads and bridges, but when I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So, and we need to accelerate the build out of that infrastructure, not just on the electricity side, but also on the hydrogen side. And what the Air Resources Board did is they modified the regulation to include something called capacity credits. So if you put in a DC fast charger, which is a very fast way of charging your car, and I'm hoping you all know what that is, but it essentially is, when you charge at home, you typically use just a wall plug, or maybe you have a level 2 charger, 240 volt, that you use for your dryer. But DC fast charging is much faster. And what Air Resources Board did is, because it also tends to be more expensive, and I think California and New York share this, our real estate is extremely valuable. So when you want to put something like a charging station, a DC fast charger, it's just expensive. And so what the Air Resources Board did was recognize that these fast chargers can accelerate the market. And Tesla stands to be the perfect example of this, in that the proliferation of fast chargers has really accelerated the market for Tesla vehicles. And so the Air Resources Board said, as a result of the fact that we know that if you have access to fast charging when you travel from, Baja, Mexico to British Columbia, Canada, that you will drive your electric vehicle more. And that will accelerate the market. They provided for something called capacity credits, which means that the DC fast charging station generates credits for the capacity, so the amount of fuel that it actually can distribute, not necessarily the amount of fuel that it does distribute. So if I own a DC fast charger, say I'm a Target or something, and I sell electricity, then I get credit, which can be sold to the oil industry and it's worth quite a bit of money. We're upwards of $200 a ton. For the capacity of that DC fast charging, minus any actual electricity fuel that I sold. So what happens is very quickly, those DC fast chargers get up to capacity. And that is partly because of the capacity credit provision that California adopted. So I just say that as a recognition that what California did as we moved forward and this policy matured is we changed it so that it was more fair to all fuels rather than just the biofuel component. So I do want to say one other thing that we did in California, and I don't, I'm just going to say that I would encourage New York as and you already have, but other states as well have worked with California policymakers, but also the stakeholder community on what worked and what didn't work. And one of the things that I would say we adopted, and it's unclear yet whether it will work, is we required the utility industry to use a portion of their credit profits to invest in a statewide clean fuel rebate program that basically served as an on-the-hood incentive for every electric vehicle sold. It has been so far extremely successful. People love it because unlike, our program in California, that's an incentive program where you get it after the fact, you go out and buy your car and then you apply for the rebate and you get it. This is, you buy the electric vehicle and on the hood, you get a $1,500 rebate. So that was a program that the Air Resources Board worked with the utility industry very closely to design, funded with the utility industry's low carbon fuel standard credits. So it was not like the government got money and government incentivized the vehicles. The utilities themselves came together and created this program, and the rebate comes from the utility, which is great for utilities because they get information about where these cars are. They can reach out to customers about all the other incentives and benefits of electric vehicles. And it also is great for the customer because they love that on the hood rebate. So we have evolved. There's no question about it. And as other states have adopted similar kinds of programs, they've done a better job than California. And I think part of that is because we have actively reached out and shared our lessons learned, while they have also helped us in California really improve the low carbon fuel standard. We haven't changed the name yet, but we have a much better program. So I'm just going to end by saying in California, we also have a cap and trade program. And a lot of naysayers, including, by the way, the opponents to the low carbon fuel standard, said, we don't need a low carbon fuel standard because you have a cap and trade program. And the bottom line is cap and trade is extremely effective and has been very effective in California at reducing the carbon content of the full economy, but it goes after the cheapest way to reduce first, right? And the bottom line is removing the carbon content from the transportation fuel sector, which is a predominantly oil, we have basically a monopoly on the transportation fuel sector, which is oil, is just more expensive. So what you have is a market failure. You have a monopoly that if you want to chip away at that monopoly, you have to have policy changes. And that's what the Lcfs did. So it complements our cap and trade program and keeps the cost of complying. We have a whole analysis on this, which I'm happy to share online with Anne or anyone else who, if we want to send it out. But where we looked at how these two policies are complementary and how they reduce each other's costs. So it costs less to comply with the cap and trade program with the existence of a low carbon fuel standard and vice versa. So with that, I just want to say that what has been surprising to me as a former policymaker and now an advocate is that this has been one of the most effective incentives for decarbonizing the transportation fuel sector, and even more, it is incredibly effective at encouraging zero emission, which is zero carbon technologies like electricity. So it serves as an incentive and a policy that actually accelerates our shared hopes to get to a zero carbon, zero emission transportation future more effectively than almost any other policy that certainly I've worked on in my 30-year career. So I just want to say, I sure hope your bill passes. Anything we can do to help, we want to do that. And I very much appreciate your time today and your invitation to speak. So thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic, really informative. And I appreciate the background history too and how the policy has evolved. I know we said we were going to do questions at the end, but I did have a few clarifying ones just from myself. You mentioned that it happened as a result of an executive order. Is that because California had underlying authority to do this through CARB already? That was one question. And you also mentioned that you had to re-adopt it in 2015. Was that because of the lawsuits that it had to be readopted, or was there a sort of an end date on the executive order?
So there was the Air Resources Board and the governor, the administration and the legislature felt that the Air Resources Board already had the authority to implement a low carbon fuel standard as long as it included the indirect land use component. So they did believe that. I will say that that was litigated, obviously, by the oil industry. And then what happened was, because it was just tenuous, people were constantly litigating, the Air Resources Board and the administration used the adoption of our climate change regulation, AB 32, which had set a cap on climate change emissions for the state, to say, and which specifically mentioned in the legislation, low carbon fuel standard, to codify, quotes, the low carbon fuel standard. So we did have legislation that was broad, but encompassed the low carbon fuel standard following the executive order. In terms of the readoption in 2015, yeah, it was exclusively the oil industry's really successful effort to slow down the low carbon fuel standard. And they did succeed in slowing it down, and it had to be readopted. And actually the curve had to be flattened a little bit because we got behind during legislation, during the litigation. So yes, it was a result of the litigation, but again, ultimately we won. It was readopted, and then it was readopted again, or not readopted, it was amended in 2018 to double the carbon content reduction requirement. So
that's great.
Fortunately, it's not succeeded.
So we have a lot of other questions for you that people have already put in Q&A, but I'm going to have Matt go ahead and speak first. And I'm going to tell all the participants, please do put your questions in Q&A because we're going to get to them next. So Matt Stanberry recently joined Highland Electric Transportation. He's the Managing Director of Market Development. But before that, he was at Advanced Energy Economy, which as an organization is a friend and partner of ACE New York. We are actually the New York State affiliate of Advanced Energy Economy. And at AEE, he oversaw their engagement at federal state levels on the EPA's regulation of carbon, from the power sector, and then also worked on transportation, obviously. Before that, he was with Navigant's energy practice, and before that with ICF International. So we are very happy to have Matt join us from his new seat, which is in an electric bus. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Matt, to talk about school bus issues, or bus issues, I should say, not just school buses.
Great, thank you, Ann, and thanks to the whole ACE team. Great to be back with you in a new capacity, and great to see Eileen and Caitlin again as well. So I'm going to take a moment to tell you here about why we're so excited about Senator Kennedy's S5268 bill that incentivizes electric school buses. Our company, Highland Electric, is focused solely on school bus electrification. The company was founded to solve two of the big issues that we found were facing schools that wanted to electrify their fleets. One being the kind of obvious upfront cost hurdle associated with electric school buses. They cost more upfront, even though they save schools a lot of money over time in reduced operations and maintenance costs. And then the second is around the complexity associated with adopting a new technology that transportation directors are generally not familiar with. Designing new electrical infrastructure and charging infrastructure that hooks into it, managing charging, dealing with a mixed fleet over time as you try to continuously progress in your electrification. So the company focuses around those two challenges and partners with schools to essentially provide a turnkey solution to electrification that provides all the necessary planning, the financing, the charging infrastructure installation and management, the school buses themselves, and the training of the school's drivers and mechanics. So what we try and do is make it simple for the schools to go electric. And the way we think about it is that we don't want the schools just to think about deploying a bus here or there if they happen to get a grant, but rather to work on plans for substantial or full electrification over time with the aim of driving towards budget neutrality for the schools relative to what they would otherwise be paying for diesel buses. And just as background, 85% of the nation's bus fleet is diesel. So earlier this year, we signed a contract with Montgomery County down in Maryland. For those of you who follow the electric vehicle industry, you may have heard about this because it was the largest electric school bus contract in the country and actually the world. It's for 326 buses. We're thinking about plans explicitly with Montgomery County about expanding that over time to think about the full fleet, which is around 1,400 school buses. Right now, we're working on implementing the first wave of school buses. We just laid conduit in their depots, in some of the depots, and we've got about 20 plus buses that are coming over the next couple of months, and then we'll have another 40 a little later this year. And then we'll be working in increments of over 100 per year over the next couple of years. So we now have projects not only in Maryland, but New Jersey, Vermont, Massachusetts, and we're now working in 17 different states around the country with school districts, including in New York. That said, there are some specific policy challenges in New York that we're wrestling with right now, which is why we're so excited about this piece of legislation. The first challenge is that New York's got an odd requirement. There aren't very many states that have this type of requirement that limits the ability of schools to sign lease-style contracts to no more than 5 years. Changing that to allow longer contracts is really important because it allows school districts to get access to electric buses at lower costs. The second challenge is that despite the fact that the state has a lot of private companies that operate school buses on behalf of school districts, New York requires those companies to pay sales tax on the school buses, which forces the companies to in turn turn around and charge the schools higher prices, which essentially ends up amounting to a tax on the schools. The third element is that New York has not had a stable incentive program. It's had some different, including one right now, incentives for electric school buses that can be accessed at a point in time, but it's not had a stable incentive program that can create the kind of certainty that allows for investment in the sector over time. If you think about it, the assets in the electric school bus industry are very large, and the manufacturing lines take time to build out. And so continuity and certainty around incentive programs is really important. And so because of that, it's because of the lack of a consistent incentive, it's been hard for companies like ours to prioritize New York relative to some other states, including Eileen's home state of California. So it's with those three policy challenges in mind that we strongly support S5268 and A6754, because those bills actually comprehensively address all three issues in a pretty straightforward manner. And we think could lead, because of all the other work New York is doing to enable electrification, to a real acceleration of school bus electrification in the state right now. Because the electric school bus industry is already delivering school buses around the country now, it means that the manufacturing lines exist. And I'll note that almost all of those manufacturing lines are domestic. By the end of this year, all major four school bus manufacturers will have electric vehicles that they're offering. Right now, 3 of them do already. And the only one of those that's not producing the vehicles domestically is based in Canada, is actually opening up some manufacturing domestically over the next couple of years. So it's a manufacturing space that's building out. There's a framework there to support expansion. So it's an ideal time for folks to think about incentive legislation to expand this industry. So that's my my quick summary, and happy to join the other panelists in Q&A. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks so much for that information, and to all three of you. What we are going to do now is put the Eileen, Matt, and Caitlin on screen, I do believe, along with me. And we're going to take some questions from the Q&A function. So we don't have a shortage of questions, but we do have about 65 people listening in. So feel free to type some questions into Q&A if you have any of them. And I'm just going to take them out of Q&A and ask them. So I'm going to start with a question, I guess, is for Matt, which is, how does the process for upgrading public bus fleets like the MTA or municipal transit authorities differ from the process for converting school bus fleets to electric?
So there are a lot of similarities, but there are also some critical differences which are actually centered around how the buses are paid for. So, from the standpoint of, designing out how your buses are going to run and the charging infrastructure, there are lots of similarities, but that financing piece is critical. So the transit bus market is principally driven by federal funds. And you actually see the Low-No program federally providing a huge chunk, almost all of the funds that transit agencies around the country are using to adopt electric transit buses. The school bus market is very different in that those funds, most of them come locally. They come out of both, and it varies by state, but in New York, for example, a big chunk of the funds come out of the state budget. And then the rest comes from the local school districts. And actually, New York has a sliding scale for it based on income levels in the localities. And so the fact that the funding mechanism is different means that the way in which electrification happens needs to be different. So you've got to be able to work within school district contracting in order to bring in electric school buses, whereas on the transit bus space, you're dealing a lot with federal government procurement, and that's one of the primary differences. In terms of the other thing I'd point out that's a little bit different is, as you're thinking about the operations of the buses, the duty cycles are very different, and so school buses are actually idle for most of the day, and generally all of the summer. And so they provide a very interesting battery resource for the grid. We use them in that way. We are actually turning on our Beverly, Massachusetts project for V2G here in a month, and are very excited about that. And transit buses are different because they tend to be operating all day. It depends on the route, obviously, but that's the general characteristic relative to a school bus. And so your charging management is different. You tend to need to do charging during the day to a certain degree, depending on your transit bus routes, where often for school buses, you don't need to do a lot of charging during the day. You can do almost all of your charging overnight. Transit buses do a good chunk of charging overnight, but they generally will often need some charging during the day as well. So that's my quick thoughts, Anne.
Thanks, Matt. All right, Caitlin, we're going to do a click check on you because you have a question here that reflects what you were speaking about, which was, when will Rivian have local sales and or service locations in New York State? And
Great question. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Now it works. Of course. Great question. Rivian wants to sell and service in New York State as soon as possible. But we do need a change in law in order to set up retail sales locations, which we're very interested in doing. We're really excited and humbled by the interest we're seeing from New Yorkers for our products and the climate impact we can really have, because like I said, we have a full-size SUV, a pickup, and a last mile delivery truck, right? So these will displace some of the heaviest passenger vehicles on the road, and also the vehicle that we're making with Amazon. So we would like to do this, certainly, but we do require this change in law, which is why we very strongly support the Senator Kaminsky and Assembly Member Fahey bills.
Thanks so much for that. We want stores to open in New York too. That's why we're working on this legislation. Here's a different topic that someone asked. Can airport ground service equipment be considered in the clean transportation sector? And this particular person said, we're considering converting ground power units to hydrogen fuel cell power, which would avoid a high cost, polluting onboard auxiliary pile unit of a ramp aircraft to be used. I wonder if any of you want to comment on that, but specifically Eileen, if you want to say if the extent, like what vehicles are included in the carbon intensity or low carbon fuel standard in California, and if ground transportation at airports would be covered.
Yeah, so that's a really excellent question, because we're part of the way there in California, and hopefully New York will not waste as much time as we've getting there. But yes, ground support equipment at both airports and seaports in most cases can generate low carbon fuel standard credits if it uses hydrogen or electricity. So one of the big credit generators in California right now is our forklift industry, which has largely gone electric. And that's largely because the safety and noise and pollution impacts, particularly for indoor forklifts. But at seaports and airports, the forklifts can also be hydrogen, and especially when you're outdoors. So absolutely, yes, any transportation, form of transportation that uses a lower carbon fuel, and especially something like a zero carbon fuel like electricity or hydrogen, can generate low carbon fuel standard credits or clean transportation credits, hopefully in New York. I will say that there are still some applications that don't qualify yet because they don't have an energy efficiency ratio. So just so you know, electric vehicles, and I know Caitlin knows this, are way more efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles. So the low carbon fuel standard, as does the New York program being considered, has a carbon intensity for the fuel, and then they have an energy efficiency coefficient for the vehicle. So if you're not an internal combustion engine, you tend to be way more efficient. So the low carbon fuel standard takes both those things into account. And in some cases, we still haven't gotten an energy efficient coefficient for certain kinds of vehicles. And we have been working with our Air Resources Board. I'm certain that will be overcome, but it's a legacy, if you will, of the idea that this is a liquid fuel, started as a liquid fuel program for internal combustion engine vehicles. And so this whole energy efficiency coefficient, which definitely holds for both electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, is really important and would need to be taken into account for ground and seaport equipment.
Another question for you, Eileen. So CARB, or Cal EPA, I'm not sure which one, is involved in all these rules that you're talking about with crediting. But does the state of California run the market where the credits are traded, or is that just done privately and they have to show CARB evidence of the credits that they bought?
Yeah, I mean, again, an excellent question. The whole thing is run, no money comes to the state. So from our clean transportation program, the credit generators are those who are generating clean fuels, whether it be electric utilities or renewable diesel folks. And even the verifiers and the people that sell those credits as their brokers basically are not associated with government. There is verification and oversight by government, but they do not, but the Air Resources Board does not act as a broker for credit trading. It's all done in the private sector with strong regulatory oversight.
Thank you. I think this one is back to you, Matt. Can the battery electric cars or school buses serve double duty and become the centerpiece of demand response vehicle to grid and vehicle to home systems? You touched on that before,
Yes.
but a little bit more on that.
Yeah, you can. We're, as I mentioned before, we're going live with vehicle to grid services in June. We are already serving as a peak demand reduction resource in Massachusetts. This is with National Grid. And we design all of our projects to have bidirectional charging for exactly that reason, that we want to take advantage of those batteries as a grid resource. The key for us and everybody in the space is that you've got to have the right utility programs and regulations in place to allow that. So we're working with utilities around the country to try to design better programs for peak demand reduction as well as V2G service delivery, and really make sure that the market is reflecting the value that those technologies are providing to the grid when the utilities need it.
Thank you. All right, Caitlin, this is for you. When it comes to charging Rivian vehicles, will there... Sorry, my screen just changed. Will there be a standard charging station for all EVs? As of now, Tesla puts their own charging station at gas stations or wherever.
Sure. So Rivian vehicles can be charged on what's become really the standard plug. So the J1772 CCS combo, the J plug, and CCS for fast charging. So Rivians can be charged on the ChargePoint, Electrify America chargers that are being built across the country, across New York. And Rivian will also invest in and build some chargers of our own, both level 2 and level 3 chargers.
Thank you. All right. Here's someone writes, I would love to see the analysis of the cap and trade and low carbon fuel standard interplay in California. That would be relevant in New York because the Transportation Climate Initiative is also part of the conversation here. So not exactly a question, but Eileen, is there an analysis of how cap and trade and LCFS have interplayed in California?
Yeah, and I will make sure, Anne, if it's okay, send it to you, and then you can forward it to whoever you want within this group. But it's publicly available on our website, calidc.com, under research. The bottom line is, when I talked about there kind of being a market failure in the transportation fuels market, that is why cap and trade alone isn't going to reduce the carbon content of fuels. You need actually a fuels policy because it's too expensive, and cap and trade or those kinds of policies go after the low hanging fruit. They're very effective, but because you have this market failure where you have basically a monopoly in the transportation fuel sector, you have to have a policy that is specific to that sector. Now, eventually, the low carbon fuel standard will work itself out of a job, right? That's the goal. At some point, these credits start to diminish because the carbon intensity of the transportation fuel sector continues to go down. So, I mean, we're still, unfortunately, a long way off from that. But with this new federal administration, there's clearly a commitment to decarbonization of the transportation fuel sector. And I do believe these kinds of policies are going to be essential. And what I would not want to have happen is this idea that suddenly you don't need a TCI, or you don't need a cap and trade program, or you don't need a economy-wide cap on emissions, in addition to addressing this market failure within our economy, which is our near total dependence on a single fuel for transportation, which is kind of the backbone of our economy. If you think about it, electricity is very diverse. You can make electricity from water. You can make electricity from solar. You can make electricity from oil, for that matter, and coal. But you can do that. So electricity is an extremely diverse fuel, whereas oil is oil, and our entire transportation sector is dependent on that. So that's what we in the economics world refer to as a market failure. And so what the LCFS does, or the clean fuels policies do, is they address that particular market failure within the context of a broader cap or economy-wide cap on emissions. Yeah. And we'll definitely share that analysis with you. But it's pretty, economics would just point to it naturally, I think.
Yeah, please do share it, and we'll pass it on to all the participants. This is being recorded, and then it goes on our website as a recap of the event with supporting materials like that. So people can check back to the website probably around Monday and get all that information. But I appreciate your remarks about, because as an organization advocating for both the Transportation Climate Initiative and the Low Carbon Fuel Standard and other transportation measures, you do hear people saying, well, why do we need this if we need that? And the reason is everything you just described. It's also that the goals in New York are so ambitious now that we really are not going to get there with just one measure or one approach. We're going to need the benefits of several of these complementary policies that can work well together. One commenter says, I'm very disappointed to hear that New York State purchase rebate for electric vehicles was recently capped at $42,000 MSRP. What is ACE and New Yorkers for Clean Power's position on this? So not really a question for you guys. That was a recent change that New York made I have to admit, I did not know that they were going to do it before they did it, although I do think some of our member companies were aware of that. I also think it's unfortunate just because by virtue of it's going to slow down, I think, electric vehicle sales because the incentive is available for less vehicle types. But I think it also underscores, maybe the larger point is that it underscores the need for a sustained source of revenue to fund these incentive programs. And New York doesn't have it. And I think the reason they changed that is because that particular incentive pot was running out of money. So I'm going to give another plug for NY for TCI, which is a coalition run by New Yorkers for Clean Power, who's co-hosting this event with us. I think one of the most important things about the Transportation Climate Initiative is that it would create a dedicated source of revenue for all these good things. And we can argue about exactly what it should be spent on. But right now, there's no source of revenue to pay for all of these things. So I think that's one thing that New York needs to pursue.
And you remember when we were telling everybody they're going to run out of money 2 years ago?
Yeah, right. It's here we are. And you know, it happens. It's not just transportation, but I've seen this in other places too, right? You have an initial interest in promoting storage. And so the state develops a small program with a pot of money to support storage, and then it's used up, which is a good thing. But unless you have a sustained source of funding for these incentives, as you pointed out, industries really can't count on New York. And then it becomes very up and down, stop and start, rather than a long-term commitment to invest continually in New York State, which is what we need. I have another question here, and this one I guess could be for Caitlin or Matt. But what would it take to get some electric vehicle manufacturing happening in New York State?
So I think when companies are looking at states to decide where to invest in new manufacturing, they look at a variety of factors. A strong workforce. Can you hear me?
I can hear about 6 of you. Are other people hearing that too, or is it just me? Yes, they are. Oh, Caitlin, I'm so sorry. Would you please telepathically send what you were going to say to Matt and have him say it?
Yeah, all right, Caitlin, you want me to guess?
We'll test you again in a second, Caitlin.
So I'll speak to the, while we try and figure out Caitlin's audio, I'll speak to the school bus manufacturer space. So a bunch of the manufacturing for school buses, as I mentioned, is domestic. There's manufacturing in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. It's some in Indiana. There's an announcement of some new manufacturing in Illinois. And I think what Caitlin was outlining is starting to outline is true for the school bus space. You know, part of what folks are looking for is space. They're looking for a trained workforce. They're looking for if they can find it, connections to a supply chain that can really help with that manufacturing area. And my old organization, Advanced Energy Economy, has produced a report on the supply chain in New York. And one of the nice things about New York is you've got a good supply chain, both on the vehicle side and the electrical industry side. So you've got pieces of that supply chain already there. You've got a relatively educated workforce, and you've got a large parts of the state that have open space available. And so you have a lot of the tools that are there to attract a manufacturing capacity. And of course, you've got some of the companies that are in the EV industry, Tesla being the most obvious, that have some facilities for production up here, although they're not making cars themselves up in New York. So I'd say there are the pieces of the equation there, but one of the keys is you often find manufacturers looking to locate as close to large markets as they can. And this gets back to the prior point, which is you need policy stability that encourages deployment in New York. That's one of the missing pieces to really drive some more incentive for manufacturing capacity in the state.
Thanks so much, Matt. Caitlin, do you want to do a little
How'd I do, Caitlin?
That's exactly what I was going to say. You nailed it.
Yeah, you do not sound great. You look good, though. You look good.
You're muted, Ann. Yeah.
Yeah, this next question.
Yeah, you're back.
I was going to ask is for you, Caitlin, but I know you can't answer it. So here, I'm going to ask the question, then I'm going to answer it, and you're going to, by virtue of your facial expressions, are going to tell me how you're doing. Because the question is, where will direct sales locations be if the cap is removed? And I'm going to guess that you would say that you do hope to start at, because we've talked about this before in all seriousness, that Rivian would start out with a small number of retail locations in New York and see how that would go. I don't think that you know yet exactly where those locations would be, but I think it would start small and go from there. And that's important to mention because some of the opposition to this bill, or all of the opposition to this bill, is coming from traditional auto dealers, which are present in all of our hometowns across New York State. And in place, I think it's important to note that in places that allow direct sales through new retail locations from Tesla or from Rivian or from Lucid, auto dealers continue to thrive. Such has been the experience in Florida and in California, for example. And I think it would be fair to say that these stores would represent a small part of the total auto sales niche in New York State, but a large and significant part of the electric vehicle sales. And that's why it's a bill that we are in favor of, not because we have anything against auto dealers, but because a company like Tesla, who has been allowed to have 5 stores in New York State, is selling a lot of cars, is selling more electric vehicles than all of the auto dealers combined, even though there are models that can be sold at those dealers as well. And the Tesla stores happen to be located downstate. I think the closest I live in Schenectady area. And so if I wanted to buy a Tesla, I would have to go to Mount Kisco or out of state, or buy it online and pick it up out of state. And we really think that New Yorkers won't start to buy electric vehicles until there's retail locations that they can go to and test drive them and see them and look at them and realize how they work. These places would have maintenance and servicing as well, and that's important. And they won't buy them until traditional auto dealers start selling electric vehicles as assertively as they sell traditional vehicles. So those two things will really encourage adoption in the individual light duty market. We need other things to encourage adoption in transit buses and school buses and ground transportation and heavy duty, et cetera. But the reason we need this in light duty is because if you buy a car, it's one of the biggest purchases that you make. And you're going to want to go to a retail location where you can meet the people selling it to you and test drive it and see how it works. So how did I do, Caitlin? Sorry about your technical difficulties. We are approaching the end of our seminar, and I think we've answered most, if not all, of the questions. I wanted to thank everyone for their participation. I wanted to see if Eileen and Matt had any last things that you wanted to mention before we close up today.
So I can, I'll just close by saying thank you, Anne. And somebody just asked a question that I can address really quickly, which is, well, what training and coaching can we all provide schools to give them a sense of the opportunity that's out there? And you've actually hit on what we spend an awful lot of our time doing within our company, is educating. on what the options are. You know, it would be nice if we were in the position of just selling what we do, but if frankly, we do a lot of baseline training for folks about what the technology can do, what the options are for getting vehicles, whether that's using Highland's model or another model, and just helping folks get comfortable with the new technology and know that it's changed a lot. We find a lot of people whose experience with it is dated at this point. They saw a pilot, 2-3 years ago, and the technology and business models, the whole ecosystem has changed a ton. And so we have a lot of educational work to do. We do a lot of it with on-the-ground partners throughout the states. So thank you, Anne. Really appreciate your team putting together this program, and thanks for all the hard work on the paper you put out.
Sure. Eileen, any parting wisdom?
No, I just want to say thank you again. The only thing I would say was there was a question in the chat box, and I just want to say that from an electric vehicle perspective, I didn't mean to sound like DC fast charging is the ultimate goal. I think it does help in corridor charging. If you want to travel long distances, it's absolutely essential. And we have in California over 40% of our residents live in multi-unit dwellings. So that's a challenge that DC fast charging may be able to help overcome. But the idea of about 50% of the people who buy electric vehicles just plug into a wall plug in their driveway or their garage. So I don't want to discount the importance of level 1, which is just your wall plug, and level 2, slower charging. That is really going to meet the vast majority of the need for electric vehicles. But I just, I am so excited that we really are, for the first time in my whole career, I feel like we have an opportunity to get off oil, and companies like Rivian and Matt's work on electric school buses, which are super important. There's a light here. We're not going to be totally dependent on an industry that is really devastating to our environment for the rest of our lives. And I feel really happy about that. And I appreciate so much being invited here today and all of the work that we've been doing in New York. So thank you.
Thank you. It's exciting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially, ACE is new to clean transportation. I know you've been working on it for the length of a career. So it's over and over with transportation. New York is copying what California has done. So we appreciate your expertise and experience, especially learning how the policy has evolved over time, so that when we put it in place here, hopefully we can have it be designed that way right from the beginning. Thank you to Matt and to Caitlin and to Eileen. Thank you also to Assemblyman Magnarelli. It was great having him here. And did everyone hear that he said it was okay if I bothered him whenever I wanted to? Because that's what I heard. So we'll be talking to him about these bills. Thank you also to Anastasia, who organized the seminar and wrote the issue brief that's now available on our website and covers all of these issues, as well as New Yorkers for Clean Power for co-hosting with us. Thank you, Michaela, and for inviting all of the members and followers of New Yorkers for Clean Power. So we really appreciate everyone's time. We look forward to movement on these bills and these issues more broadly to really clean up the transportation sector in New York. And that brings us to 3:30. So thanks so much for joining, and we'll talk soon. The next in our seminar series is June 17th, and it's on energy efficiency. So we will be sending out information about that one. But throughout the course of the year, we're going to have one on energy efficiency. Our annual renewable energy tour is going to be online this year. We're doing investments in ports to host offshore wind in September during Climate Week. So please join for all of those, and have a great afternoon. Thanks.